Alright, good evening, students of Shankism. My name is Mr. Woods, and Mr. Shank has invited me back once again to speak to you all about something very near and dear to my heart, which is the late Middle Ages or early Renaissance poet and author Dante Alighieri. So, without further ado, Dante, or as we'll probably most commonly refer to him, and typically that name evoke an image of the underworld of hell, which is what Dante is most closely associated with, given his magnum opus text, the Divine Comedy, the first book of which is Inferno. Everything from pop culture to video games draw upon this as a subject of influence, so we'll just probably refer to him as Dante. But before we get into talking about the Divine Comedy, there's a bit of other material to cover here. Just give you a little bit of a background for Dante and where he's coming from and what the world of Florence, Italy is like that he's living in. So I know we learn about Dante associated with the Renaissance in Italy, but to be fair, Dante's time is right before the Renaissance. So Dante lives and dies before the Black Plague or the Black Death hits Italy and kind of leads into the eventual Renaissance, which, given our current situation here, sitting among the pandemic circles of the coronavirus, we should take heart in that, Italy and most of Europe bloomed out of this plague into a renaissance, into a beautiful rebirth. So let's hope that we can manage the same thing without the deaths of 1/3 of our population. Anyway, back to Dante. So Dante is born sometime in the year 1265. So kind of the middle or heading on the downward slope of the 13th century. So again, it's late Middle Ages technically, but he's kind of the early precursor of the Renaissance. So he doesn't have a nice, neat location that he fits into. So we're going to tuck him into the Renaissance. But he's born in Florence, which is an up-and-coming city at this time. I mean, Florence is very old, but at this time, Florence is starting to gain more repute, and it's probably, maybe third in line, maybe fourth in line in power in Italy. You have Rome, and you have the Venetians, and I guess Ravenna is probably still pretty big at this time. So Florence is there on the world stage, even if they're not at the top at this point. So we don't know a whole awful lot about Dante and his early life. He wasn't born into some wealthy and powerful family. He was not a prodigy, a child prodigy, to where we would have records of his life at a very early age, or distinguishing characteristics like you might find with someone like, say, we'll say Da Vinci, right? We know quite a bit about Da Vinci's early days and his early painting, but we don't know a lot about Dante in that way. Most of what we do know about him comes from his actual writing. So Dante claims to be descended from ancient Romans, which, given his location in Italy, as long as his family is relatively homogenous, is very likely. I mean, it's, if they married into people and other families within the same location, it's quite likely that he carries that same bloodline. His father is Alighiero, hence Dante's last name, Dante Alighieri, so he's Dante, son of Alighiero. So he was allied with a faction in Florence and Italy in general, known as the Guelphs. And that's Guelphs. So the Guelphs. Now, this faction, along with many others, are like small war bands in a way that throw their support behind any number of characters. And in this situation, these Guelphs are in support of the Pope. So, they are sort of staunch defenders of the Pope, and their kind of opposing faction is a group known as the Ghibellines. which is a kind of ardent supporter of the Holy Roman Emperor of the time. So you have these two almost competing factions operating in this part of the world. And if you know anything about Italian history, which given our probably previous study of the Romans, you know it's very backroom politics. It's very much the way you think of the mafia, right? That has that stereotype for a reason. So you have these families of a lot of power and these warring factions operating within, and then you toss all of that into the Middle Ages. You've got men in armor fighting, and that's what these two groups did. Occasionally they met in battle, and again, Dante's family was allied with the Guelphs. Now that's going to come into play in a little bit because Dante is going to carry on that relationship. But as Dante got older, at a young age, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of like 15 or 16, he's promised in marriage, which, you know, arranged marriages in this time period are not at all strange. And so he's promised in marriage to a woman named Gemma di Manetto Donati. And he'll end up marrying her, though she's not going to outlive him. But, you know, arranged marriages were not always done in the favor of love, right? There's other reasons to arrange marriage, especially if you're a kind of a middle to upper class family and you're struggling to maybe make a name for yourself, which in this period, Dante's family, being allied with the Guelphs, who were losing in some of these factional wars, would have been looking for a way to gain more standing, more bearing in their city. So, you know, intermarriage is a good way to grow relationships. So Dante did have a love, right? He claimed to be in love with a woman that he met when he was about 9, and would have known. He would have been around her, named Beatrice Portinari. Now, Beatrice is going to be kind of a love lost. She's going to end up married to someone else, and then she will die. I think she was around the same age as Dante, so she would have been about 25. So she dies in 1290. And of course, this is, you know, something that destroys Dante almost on a personal level, and most of his writing going forward, the character of Beatrice will be a recurring character, and through Dante's Inferno, and into Purgatorio and Paradiso, the entire Divine Comedy, Beatrice is a recurring character. But we'll come back to that too. Dante's education, you know, you have these great artists and writers and you know, historians and theologians of the past, but they don't have formalized education, and Dante sort of fits into that. We don't know exactly, you know, where he went to school or what his education was. We do know that he did receive formal schooling. It was probably some type of cathedral school or church school established for middle to upper class to learn to read and write, you know, gain some biblical understanding, and that's going to shine through as well. We do know that at some point in this period, Dante delved into the classics, into the works of Cicero, of Ovid, and particularly Virgil. Now, it's not that he didn't study the Greeks, because most of his worldview is built off of the science of Aristotle, Ptolemy, but, you know, he would have had more of an affinity for ancient Roman authors, in particular Virgil, than others, because, again, he's descended, or claims to be descended from these Romans. So, as Dante's life went on, he supported the Guelphs, and the Guelphs would split into two factions. You have the white Guelphs and the black Guelphs. So these factions split apart, and Dante fights in a couple different battles along the sides of the Guelphs to you know, kick out the Ghibellines and secure power in Florence. And then when these factions within the Guelphs split apart, you have one group, which is the group Dante is allied with, the white Guelphs, who want to kind of have a more independent Florence. I mean, they want Florence to be a powerful state, and they want it to be allied with the Pope more than the Holy Roman Emperor, but they want their distance from both. The other faction within the Guelphs are known as the Black Guelphs, and they have a closer tie to Rome. Right? So they want to bring not just Roman culture and influence, but Roman control onto Florence. And so this was something that was, you know, very threatening in the time period. And Dante would be part of a guess, a group of, I don't want to say negotiators, but maybe ambassadors that go to Rome to speak with the Pope. Now, somehow during this time period, the Black Guelphs are able to overthrow the White Guelphs back in Florence and take control of the city. Dante never makes it back to Florence. So he's in Rome when they take over Florence, and they start dealing out justice, and Dante's, as being somebody who has kind of betrayed their cause or betrayed this new government they're building, will be sentenced to exile. Not just exile, but exile with a fine. Dante is levied this hefty fine and a 2-year exile in 1301, and Dante will never return ever to Florence. Not even his body makes its way back to Florence. In fact, I'll fact check this while I'm thinking, but I believe Dante's body is interred in maybe Ravenna here. Yes, Ravenna, the papal state. So Dante doesn't make it back to Florence ever, and I know that his body doesn't make it back. In fact, there is, I guess, in a way, one piece of him that's there, the supposed death mask of Dante Alighieri, which, a little bit of a tangent, but the medieval world is kind of strange, and so embalming is a relatively advanced process that they didn't fully partake in, but one of the things they would do is they would cast a death mask. So it's almost like paper mache style, but it's wax and a paraffin, and they would take a casting of the face of the person who had died, and then actually make like a cast mask from that, like almost like a clay. And so that, I believe, is in Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. I think in their museum they have the Dante death mask. Now there's a lot of controversy over whether or not that's actually Dante's face, or if it's a later recreation or kind of like something that's been fabricated over time. But as far as we have evidence to believe, it's likely it could be the death mask of Dante, and so in a way he made it back to Florence, I suppose. It's during this period of exile that Dante begins writing La Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy. Among other things, of course, he has a wide range of work that we'll hit in a second, and then we'll spend a little bit more time on the Divine Comedy. I'm not going to sit here and read you all 900 plus pages of it, but there are a few things that I want to touch on, and maybe we'll talk about the first few cantos of the Inferno. Really, the part that's singularly most important is the influence that Dante had on the late Middle Ages, that kind of transfer period between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance in Italy. So one of the major things that Dante did was change the language in which poetry and writing would occur. So instead of writing in Latin, like almost all medieval writers did, he wrote in his vernacular, his native tongue, which would have been Italian. So this does a couple things. One, it kind of creates a solid Italian language for the Italian people, because this was a spoken language, although it could be written, but it hadn't been categorized in this way. So Dante's writing really does that. It also instills this sense of nationalism, kind of this love of your country and your culture and your people. So it helps to bring that, and it lays a foundation for later writers to do the same thing. So if you look at your more influential writers in the later parts of the Renaissance, if you look at Machiavelli, right? So Machiavelli's Prince is in Italian, Il Principe, right? So he's writing in Italian. The Book of the Courtier by Castiglione, again, it's also written in Italian. So these major writings, and even as you move into the Northern Renaissance and hit folks like Erasmus, although arguably he does a lot of work in Greek, but translating more or less, and Sir Thomas More, you're seeing writing done in the native language of the people. I would say one of the other big things is introducing humanism. So, we credit Francisco Petrarch with being the father of humanism, which is fair. But Dante's work really kind of helped to lay the foundation for that. Humanism is this strange movement at the time because it's really about humans, right? It's about the human advances, human successes of the period, and not so much focusing on the divine. So in the Middle Ages, everything is credited to the divine and to the gods, right? Or God, if you're talking about Christian Europe. Take, the Crusades, whether it's praise be to God in Christian Europe or Alhamdulillah in the Middle East, right? You're still seeing this emphasis on God. Credit is given to God. When you look at Dante's work, especially the Divine Comedy, it's a bridge, right? It's very much about human suffering and the human journey, taking voice within this divine transition. So it's kind of a middle point. And of course, a lot of influence there from the classics, and a lot of it goes into shaping later romantic writing. Now, Dante came before Petrarch, and certainly some of Petrarch's work would build from Dante. We have to draw a line somewhere. Somebody's got to be the father of something, right? Back to works or things we can attribute to Dante. The other thing is the rhyming scheme that he creates. So it's called terza rima, which is a 3-line rhyming scheme. The way this works, a rhyme scheme for his poetry, where the last word in the second line is going to provide the rhyme for the first and third lines of the following set of 3 lines. So if you look at the way Dante's work's written, it's in chunks of 3. So 3 lines per what is called a tercet, and each one of these is going to form a verse rhyme for a later line. This is something that isn't used as commonly today, perhaps, but I'll give you an example. So I just pulled one up, and so the way this would work would be if you're used to seeing any type of Shakespearean rhyme schemes where they use the letter, it's kind of an A B A B C B C D C D E D, so forth. So, for example, this is the examples drawn from The Eternal Dawn of Blissful Bodhi by Brian Chung. Right, so we are mired in a dark quagmire of cruel and murky quicksand. We dance no more to karma's lyre and vow for the western pure land. The eternal dawn of blissful Bodhi arising by Amida's hand. So you can see how, the first and third lines rhyme quagmire and lyre, and then the second and fourth lines with quicksand and pure land create that rhyming scheme. So this is something that we credit to Dante and his work as kind of being a founding voice for. As far as his actual works, there's a few books to note before we talk about the Divine Comedy. So De Monarchia, which is his treatise on, as you can probably derive from the name, monarchs, basically the struggle between ecclesiastic and secular power. So you have the Holy Roman Emperor on one side and the Pope on the other. Where does that power lie? Who has more and why? To spoil it, Dante basically surmises that neither has more power than the other because they're necessarily separated powers for particular purposes. So, a separation of church and state in a way of thinking. The other one that's really big and as a kind of a formative text is one that was not finished. It's called De Vulgari Eloquentia, or On Eloquence in the Vernacular. So this is based off of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, which is basically it was foiled because nobody could speak the same language. They couldn't communicate, and then they're scattered to the winds, creating the kind of foundations for the world's different languages. And this was Dante's attempt at tracing root languages back to some core grammatica or core language that existed. It's an abandoned text because that's very difficult to do. There's claims about kind of like Indo-European languages that you could find some root for, but obviously if we think about world history as we've studied it, at some point there is a first language, but where do you put that pedestal? Who do you hand that to and say, okay, well you have the first languages from which all later languages will be derived? That's very difficult to do. Next would be La Vita Nuova, which is a book of poetry. It's very personal. much in the same way that the Confessions of St. Augustine are very personal. It's about discussing love and how romantic love helps build capacity for divine love or spiritual love. So the love one has for their neighbor or someone in this secular world provides the ability to hold spiritual love for God. Next is Il Convivio, which is a collection of philosophy and politics, and basically it works like an encyclopedia for its time. So all the collected knowledge that Dante could get his hands on in a single book to kind of walk one through really the 14th century. And again, we see reference to Beatrice and this sort of divine love and this I think he seconds Beatrice only to Lady Philosophy, as he describes her. That brings me to the Divine Comedy. So there's a few things to go over here. First of all, it's not actually a comedy, the way we think of it. Though there are elements of it that I think are funny. It's not meant to be funny, right? This is a text that's meant to be taken seriously. What is, the comedy of it is more the way it's constructed. So it's an epic poem in the same way that Homer's Iliad or Virgil's Aeneid is an epic poem. So it's set in the week of Easter, and it's actually time period wise quite short, the setting of the story. And of course this is a fictional story. It's a creation of Dante where he's the main character, and it basically details his journey really through kind of waking up in this dark woods, which is kind of known there and again depending on how the translation of the text you have, or and I think Mr. Shank will probably share with you the translation that one of the translations I have, which is the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow translation. It's probably a bit more poetic. I'm drawing from the John Ciardi translation, so it's a bit different. Dante's first tetrakt here is: midway in our life's journey, I went astray from the straight road, and woke to find myself alone in a dark wood. How shall I say? What wood was that? I never saw so dear, so rank, so arduous a wilderness. It is memory that gives a shape to fear. Basically, Dante starts off awakened in this darkened wood, and the story is going to detail his journey into Inferno, into hell, and hell is described as a depression in the earth, from which, if we're getting biblical, where Lucifer was cast out of heaven, when he struck the earth, he created this kind of, you can think of it as like a funnel or an inverted cone shape, with him kind of at the center of the earth. So Lucifer represents the center of the earth, which is, in Dante's case, freezing, not liquid magma like we might imagine today. In that way, it's very much based off of like Nordic myth, where hell is a frozen wasteland. But Dante works his way down this cone and then hits the other side. As he kind of climbs down Lucifer's leg, the world flips and he climbs back up to the other side, where he will see this mountain in the distance, and he'll scale this mountain that is Purgatorio, or purgatory, right? The kind of level of suffering that one has to go through to, or suffering or repentance, I guess would probably be a better way to describe it, to sort of unlock their way into heaven, right? So if you remember, Mr. Shank, I'm sure, talked about the selling of indulgences and such during the Middle Ages. So people would sin, naturally, especially soldiers, right? They would go out and kill, and in the case of the Crusades, the Pope offers remission of sin, that your sin will sort of be washed away, anything you do. Well, if that's not the case and you go to war, even if you're fighting, killing people is still bad. So you would have knights that would pay monks in monasteries. They'd donate large sums of money, and monks and monasteries would just pray for their eternal souls. And you build churches and you do all these things to help to lessen the time that you're going to spend in purgatory, suffering to earn your way into heaven. So this is kind of the mentality. But the buying of indulgences is one of the things that causes the church some issues in the late Middle Ages and going into the Renaissance. They're basically selling slips of paper that were get out of hell free cards, more or less. And then the story ends with Dante making it into Paradiso, into paradise, into heaven, and exploring the spheres of this. So the story is built in the order of 9 plus 1, so everything has 9. There's 9 circles of hell, there's 9 tiers of purgatory, there's 9 spheres of heaven. And it's 9 plus 1, so there's additional layers there. There's like the antechamber to hell and such. Now, this even fits the mold of the book. The book itself has an introduction, and then it has 33 cantos per book, rounding out into 100 cantos, so 99 plus 1 in that case. But if we're going to stick to talking about Inferno, and I know I've already stolen much of your time, but when there's a plague about, what better things do you have to do than listen to me? So I want to look through just a little bit of Inferno with you all. And I know, like I said, Mr. Shank will likely put a copy of this out there, and if you want to read it, it really is fascinating, especially if you can catch an edition that has footnotes to kind of pull you back into all the historical context and such. It really is a very interesting text because it's different than anything in its time period. It stands out even to today. One of the images I recommend pulling up if you get an opportunity is a painting. And so the painting is called La Mappa dell'Inferno, and it was created by Sandro Botticelli. So Botticelli made this painting in somewhere between 1480 and 1490, more or less meant to be a map of Inferno, and it's artistic, but you can see the conical shape and kind of the end of it being Lucifer. But the first layer is really the one that I like to focus on the most. So it starts with this dark wood, right, or the dark wood of air. This midway upon the journey of our life. So Dante is alluding to his age here, right? The average age biblically at that period is often regarded as being about 70. So midway upon that journey, he's saying he's about 35, where he loses this straightforward path. So Dante loses his way. So the dark wood is representative of this worldliness, the actual world. The sun ends up behind the shadows, which is divine illumination, right? It's lost to him. He's in the darkness. And he faces these beasts, these monsters, right? There's a leopard, malice and fraud, some of the harder sins. A lion that represents violence and ambition. A she-wolf, which represents incontinence. So these sins challenge Dante and cause him to flee, and all of a sudden this shade, which is what he refers to almost like what you would think of as ghosts, appears before him, and it's Virgil. So Virgil, being the ancient Roman author and poet, Virgil appears before Dante and tells him that he was sent by Saint Lucia and Beatrice and Mary, all of these very, in Dante's mind, divine figures to guide Dante back. And before Dante can get to heaven, he has to travel through hell, through the Inferno. So Dante is going to start off with the descent, right? Kind of one of these lines that I always enjoyed. Now go, for one soul will is in us both. Thou leader, and thou lord, and master thou. Thus said I to him, and when he had moved, I entered on the deep and savage way. So basically he's conversing with Virgil at this point. Virgil's explaining how he got sent here and what they have to do. Dante's overcoming his early fears, which is a lot of this story. There's a lot of back and forth where Dante's overcoming his fears throughout this period. The next canto, or next little chapter here, is the vestibule of hell. It's kind of this front entryway of hell. So Dante enters into this antechamber of hell, and he's going to see some people, and that's one of the other interesting things about Dante's Inferno is he encounters historical people. Mostly they're people from Dante's time period or right before, because remember, this is set in 1300, but Dante's writing this somewhere between like 1301 and 1310, so he's writing it after the fact, so he can have this kind of prophecy that's going to come true by talking about the past. And he does this, he puts words into the mouths of people from the past quite a bit. So in this location, he's going to encounter opportunists and outcasts, right? People who couldn't make a decision. So Pope Cleophistines V is one of them, who, the great denial, right? He couldn't decide what to do with his power. And this is where we see the concept of contrapasso brought in. So contrapasso is this concept of basically you get what you deserve, in the sense of you get kind of the opposite of what you did wrong. So in the case of these opportunists, right, they were idle in their lifetime. They didn't do anything, or they didn't make any choices. So in their afterlife, here in the antechamber of hell, they're going to be forever chased and bit and pursued by bugs, and at the feet of their, as they flee through this chamber, there's just blood that's kind of sweeping over the floors, which just feeds the worms and maggots that live on the floor. And so it's a very nasty place, and they're chasing this banner that they're never going to catch, right? It just flies through the air. In this chamber, you also see, Dante describes the angels who couldn't pick a side in the war of heaven. Right? So nobody, angels that couldn't decide which way they wanted to go, whether they wanted to side with God and Michael and the angels of heaven, or whether they wanted to side with Lucifer. Right? So you've got this kind of split, and these angels that couldn't make a decision are forever trapped in this vestibule area. So they pass the shore of the river Acheron, where Virgil, again, we're delving into Greek mythology here a bit, he gets a passage, he gets boat passage with Charon. Dante, the earth kind of shakes and the boat moves, and Dante is unconscious for part of this trip, and when he wakes up, he's on the other side, he's in limbo. This location that's known as the Dolorous Abyss. So it says, in his text, he describes it as, or the people that live here, as, that they sin not, and if they merit had, 'tis not enough, because they had not baptism, which is the portal of the faith thou holdest. So, in other words, the limbo is this location for people basically pre-Christianity. So anybody who was, relatively good in life, they didn't sin, they weren't evil, but they also weren't Christians, or they're not worthy of going to heaven. They live in this limbo, this dolorous vale. So these are the virtuous unbaptized. Here Virgil describes the harrowing of hell, where he explains it as the one. Dante never uses the name Jesus, but he just refers to the one who came and brought some of these shades from this area of limbo into heaven. So he explains that he came and took Adam, and he took Moses and Abraham, and he goes on, Rebecca. He goes on to explain all of these people that were taken out of limbo and brought to heaven. So this is very much in line with the Christian theology there. Through this, Dante is going to encounter a few individuals that really strike him as somebody that he would agree with, or that he's excited to be with. So he's going to be, of course, accompanied by Virgil, and he's going to encounter the poets, the four as he describes them. So you have Homer, you have Ovid, Horace, and Lucan. So together they're six, and they're within the citadel, this location of human reason, and it's divided into really 7 different pieces, the trivium and the quadrivium, which are Aristotle's segments of what the world looks like. And in here, even Aristotle can be found. Right? He's one of the members of this dolorous vale, the limbo of the unbaptized. Dante describes it as, he says, "And more of honor still, much more they did me, in that they made me one of their own band, so that the 6th was I, mid so much wit." So, in other words, he's brought in to accompany these poets, becoming the 6th of their number, which to Dante, of course, is a great and wonderful thing. And the contrapasso for this limbo is that since these individuals are born without the light of Christ, right, and the revelation, they can't come into the light of God. They're virtuous pagans. They're not tormented. They just have no hope. So there's this suffering of hopelessness that's prevalent there. Like I said about him bringing in people that you may recognize, I'll run through a few of these names that you should probably know. So within this limbo of the unbaptized. This is where he, some of his heavy hitters are for famous names. You have Hector, which, of course, if you're familiar with the Iliad at all, Hector of Troy, and he's going to be a key figure too, because it's the Trojans who would, in that line, go on later to become the early Romans, from whom Dante is going to claim to be descended of. You're also going to find Aeneas there. Caesar is here. Numitor and Rhea Silvia, right? The kind of forebearers of the Romans. Brutus, and this is the original Brutus, and Lucrezia, the Brutus who would drive out Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome. You'll also see Saladin. And I always thought this one was quite interesting, because you see this Muslim general in this location. So you have a couple things coming into play here. One is he's not Christian, so in Christian belief and in Dante's belief, he wouldn't have been able to access heaven. But Saladin was so well respected in the Christian world, among even Christian generals at the time, that he was not seen as bad. He was seen as very intelligent, a very cunning man, a very cunning leader. So very much respected. So he holds a place of honor in Dante's text, which is just, it's very interesting, given that Dante's not writing that long after, a couple hundred years after that period of the Crusades. You've got Aristotle here, Socrates, Plato, Democritus, a lot of these Greek philosophers, Heraclitus, and then you hit some other names. Orpheus is here, which is from myth. Seneca, Euclid, Ptolemy. One of the ones I found interesting, again, you've got Averroes, who is the commentator, right, from the Muslim world. He's the commentator on Aristotle's work. So he can be found here in the limbo of the unbaptized. Probably the most interesting thing about Dante's Inferno, or Dante's Divine Comedy, is, like his entire text, it ends on sort of a happy note, I guess, right? So the entire text is going to end with Dante kind of being enveloped into God's grace, becoming one with God's grace. And not that it's going to spoil the story for you, but Dante ends with stars, right? So he's been trapped underground, traveling through all of these circles of hell, which, of course, there's 9, and then you have the Malabolge, which are the evil ditches, right? So there's further divided sections, and he covers a lot of the major sins. He's going to hit lust, and he's going to hit gluttony and greed and wrath, and you're going to find all of these key historical people along the way that he's going to speak to or be a part of. There's a lot of information packed into this, a lot of symbolism, a lot of numerology. It's a wonderful read. But I'll give you the last lines of Dante's text here, just to send us off. Of course, he's been traveling with Virgil. He's finally made it to the center of the earth, climbed down Satan's leg, and he ends with, "My guide and I crossed over and began to mount that little known and lightless road, to ascend into the shining world again. He first, I second. Without thought of rest, we climbed the dark until we reached the point where a round opening brought in sight the blessed and beauteous shining of the heavenly cars, and we walked once more beneath the stars." So there's hope, right? Dante awoke in this hopeless wood of error, right? The wood of his sin, and he's going to escape hell to see the stars. Not just the stars, but in his mind, the stars of the southern hemisphere, right? He's made it to the other side of the world. He's both realistically, in his view, and metaphorically turned over a new leaf, right? He has completely switched his worldview, and now, having come through this great trial, is prepared to continue to work hard to attain that which he desires. Right? It's all about putting in the time and effort and the work to get where you want to be. And though in Dante's story, there's an eventual happy ending, Dante himself never gets to see his homeland again. So, through the eyes of death, he witnesses Florence from the Palazzo Vecchio in that city. Anyway, I've dragged on long enough. It's been wonderful speaking to you all. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed this. I know that I have, and I will be happy to be speaking with Mr. Shank again soon. So this is Mr. Woods wishing the students of Shankism a wonderful pandemic night.